Everyone. So we just did a video on really organizational power and politics, and now I want to dive into conflict and negotiation. It seems like the most natural part here. And these are two really critical skills for navigating today's workplace. So whether you're working, in a small team, maybe you're leading an entire department or partnering across different cultures, you are going to encounter disagreements. That is inevitable, right? You're going to encounter disagreements, competing interests, and even the need to find common ground. So, really, I'll start with a real world example, right? Over the past few years, Google actually ended up terminating dozens of employees for sexual harassment. And while they had policies in place and procedures, controversy exploded when reports surfaced that a former executive who was actually accused of misconduct was given a multi-million dollar exit package. Now, as you can see, right, the situation will and did actually ignite several protests and made global headlines. This is a powerful reminder that when conflict isn't addressed transparently, if it's not addressed fairly, it can damage trust, morale, and reputation that are far beyond that company's, four walls. So I want to explore four main areas today in conflict and negotiation. And the first is how to recognize and resolve both short-term and long-term conflicts. So whether it's between individuals, groups, entire departments. The second is how conflict actually arises in organizations. The third is how to negotiate effectively. So when do we use it? How do we prepare for it? And how do we reach agreements that are mutually beneficial for both parties? And then using an example, right, how to navigate some cultural differences in negotiation styles so that communication can remain very clear and respectful. Now, key takeaway, conflict is not always a bad thing. In fact, healthy conflict can spark creativity and it can spark and surface important issues and lead to better decision making. But if we leave conflict unmanaged, it can actually cause lasting harm. Now, negotiation, on the other hand, isn't just about compromise. It is the art of finding solutions that work for all of the parties involved, right? Even when interests, priorities, or cultural norms differ, sorry. So let's understand the nature of conflict in organizations. And that really starts with understanding the basics of organizational conflict. And I want to unpack different forms and levels of conflict. Conflict in organizations isn't always dramatic. It's not always one blow up that happens, right? It actually oftentimes stems from very simple everyday misalignments. And conflict arises when a person or group feels frustrated. And that's the keyword, frustrated in pursuing goals, plans, or objectives. And that frustration can show up in very distinct forms, four of them particularly. And the first is it can show up in goal conflict. So this is when two parties want different outcomes. The second is in cognitive conflict. And this is where ideas and perspectives clash. The third is affective conflict. So it's really fueled by emotional tension or maybe personal dislike. And then there's behavioral conflict. And this is when someone's actions are just seen as inappropriate, right? Or unacceptable. So think of inappropriate dress, think of rude language. Now, conflict also plays out at four different levels. There is interpersonal conflict, and that's really conflict, and I'm sorry, intrapersonal conflict. That's conflict I have within myself. There's interpersonal conflict, which is conflict between individuals. There's intergroup conflict, which is between maybe teams or departments. And then there's even interorganizational conflict, right? Maybe across separate entities, even. And each level brings unique challenges for resolution. Now, you're understanding these types, understanding these levels of conflict is really your first step toward handling them effectively. And if a disagreement is cognitive, like differing opinions, how to approach a problem, that is very different from a situation where emotions run high and resentments have already built up. And resolving a tense relationship with a colleague looks different from mediating two competing departments. Now, I want to dive deeper into why conflicts arise in the first place. And there are some key causes of organizational conflict. And I will say organizations don't, have conflict for no reason, right? There are several common factors that tend to inflame tensions. And Robert Miles actually highlights some of the most frequent culprits. The first is task interdependencies, and this is when teams have to work very closely together. When they do that, oftentimes small disagreements can snowball. especially when we don't align expectations. So, for example, you might be launching a product. If marketing is expecting new features to be released by week 4, but development plans to only do this by week 6, tension arises. And that's not necessarily intentional. It's not due to malice, it's just differing priorities and timelines. The second are status inconsistencies, and conflict can emerge when people perceive unfair differences in treatment. So, for instance, when managers get to adjust their schedules or take unplanned personal time, where frontline staff actually have to strictly follow their shift schedules, that is inconsistency. And that inconsistency oftentimes can breed conflict and resentment. The third is jurisdictional ambiguities. So, role confusion, and this is a huge one. Role confusion can actually spark these like territorial turf battles. Like two departments claiming responsibility for hiring decisions, or two departments, claiming responsibility for the budget approval. If we don't set very clear boundaries, people will step on each other's toes without meaning to. Now, additional causes include things like communication breakdowns, shared resource pools is a very common one, lack of common performance standards, even individual differences, all of which can create friction when it's not managed proactively. Now, together, these causes form a 4-stage conflict process. So it's almost like a model, right? The first one being frustration. I mentioned that at the beginning. So frustration being defined as somebody's goal being blocked. The second is diagnosis. So understanding the root problem of the conflict. The third is behavioral action. So how people respond to that conflict. And the fourth is the outcome. So the resolution or the escalation. We can use an example. So let's say you are a part of a sales team and you are relying on finance to approve a promotional discount for a product. But finance doesn't do that because they're stating that they don't have a clear standard for what qualifies for this promotional discount. Now, you as the sales rep, you may feel blocked, right? Tensions may rise. That frustration might be there. And then both sides end up blaming each other, right? That is one high interdependence, right? Sales needs finance to act. Finance is waiting for the criteria. And with no defined jurisdiction, with no shared standard, these conflicts can erupt. Now, understanding these root causes is essential because only by pinpointing what is actually fueling the conflict can you actually intervene effectively, right? Rather than treating the symptoms on the surface. Now, let's explore how to resolve it, right? And ultimately negotiate better outcomes. And that's what I want to do now is just guide you through some strategies to resolve conflict more constructively and dive in and discover what works and what doesn't, right? And so again, I think third time I'm mentioning that conflict isn't inherently negative, right? When we can manage it properly, it can actually spark growth and learning. But the real challenge is choosing the right resolution strategy. And too often, managers end up defaulting to methods that actually make things worse. And so I want to start by talking about the most ineffective approaches that we should avoid. The first is non-action. We don't want to pretend like the conflict doesn't exist. This actually rarely makes the problem go away and usually lets it fester, right? Expanding and making the frustration worse, right? Making the conflict worse, building that resentment even more, eroding that trust and morale. The second is administrative orbiting. So fascinating term, but this is where managers say the issue is understudy. Like we know it's a problem, we're reviewing it, but they don't really take action, right? And that actually heightens frustration rather than resolves it. The third is due process inaction. And this is where maybe I'm intentionally setting up a grievance procedure that's super, super long and I'm doing it on purpose. And it's maybe discouraging. Effectively, I'm wearing you down. That's due process non-action. There's secrecy. So this is where we're withholding information, right? That when we do that, that causes suspicion and it erodes trust. And then there's character assassination. So dismissing maybe the person that's bringing forth the conflict as like a troublemaker, right? Which often silences that person, right? But it does so at the cost of integrity and morale. So what does work? I think there are several, proactive strategies for preventing and reducing conflict. The first thing you can do is emphasize organization-wide goals. And that is to align everybody toward a shared vision and a shared purpose. And if you can tie something to something bigger than yourself, that is always a very helpful strategy in resolving conflict. You can also structure tasks clearly to avoid confusion so that that confusion doesn't breed disagreement. You can encourage intergroup communication to bridge any divides and then avoid win-lose situations. You want to seek as much as possible, right, shared value outcomes. Now, for reducing conflict that already exists, there are some other strategies that include things like physically separating groups, right? If tensions are high, let's give each group space to reset. You can apply rules and regulations consistently to everybody. That's important. You can limit unnecessary interactions between groups that are like at war. You can use integrators, right? People who can bridge and connect groups. You can engage in confrontation followed by negotiation. So you can address those issues head on. You could seek third-party consultation, so maybe an impartial mediator to guide some of that discussion. Sometimes HR gets kind of pulled in as that mediator, depending on how severe the conflict is, and rotating team members, right? Defining superordinate goals, offering intergroup training to build shared understanding. And so effective conflict resolution is not about avoidance. It's about clarity, it's about communication, and really using structure and people thoughtfully to resolve issues and to foster collaboration. So I want to now focus on the next critical step of conflict, and that's negotiation behavior. And it's important to walk through how to plan and conduct productive negotiations. And so we'll explore some of these stages and strategies and the role of culture and effective bargaining. Now, negotiation isn't just for executives, it's not just for diplomats. It is a fundamental skill that we use every day, sometimes without us really knowing it, because the word negotiation oftentimes seems very formal, but we do use it every day to resolve conflict, to bridge gaps, to reach agreements. And so there are three key areas that I'll cover. And the first is the stages of negotiation. So while the length and the form may vary, most negotiations follow four general stages, and it begins with non-task times. And this is where negotiators really ease into the conversation. Sometimes it's through relationship building, sometimes it's through small talk. There are types of negotiation behavior. So learning how negotiations can take a distributive form, really where one party's gain is another party's loss, or an integrative approach where both sides are working to expand options and really discover mutual value. And then the negotiation process. So effective negotiation does require clear planning. It does require that you understand the conflict, knowing your goals, maybe choosing the right negotiator if you do need to bring in somebody like formal or some unbiased third party, and also understanding the other party's perspective. Now, I will say cultural differences play a vital role, influencing communication style, persuasion techniques, and how negotiations unfold. So I will, let's see how this might play out in real life. Imagine you're part of a cross-functional negotiation over project deadlines between maybe a marketing group in the US and a product development team in Japan. Now, right from the start, during this non-task phase, right, where we're just kind of starting to get, meet, the US team may jump straight into the logistics, right? This is the plan, this is what we like to do. While the Japanese team begins with polite introductions, right, and relationship building, because that is very important. They are very relationship focused. That is of value to them. Now, those cultural differences will affect the pace and tone of the entire negotiation. So as the conversation advances, right, a distributive mindset might emerge with each side, right, pushing to maximize their benefits. But if both teams take an integrative approach, which is what we want, they can uncover options like shifting priorities or maybe even adjusting timelines that allow both sides to win. Throughout all of this, preparation really matters. So having a clear understanding of your goals and really knowing your resistance point, and when I say resistance point, that's how far you're willing to go. And understanding the other side's cultural norms gives you much better footing in negotiation. So negotiation, right, just as a reminder, isn't simply about claim making. It is a very structured process that's shaped by strategy, empathy, and even cultural awareness. And I will say, and I think I've mentioned it in a prior video, but there's a book out there that I love, and building cultural awareness or cultural intelligence is extremely important, especially as we continue to globalize and work across different cultures. And I would say there's a book out there. It's called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. I highly recommend it. It has like every single country you could think of, negotiation styles, communication styles, what the government is like, gift giving, like just a bunch of tips and tricks to really build that cultural intelligence. And so if you can maybe attend training or maybe read this book and just start learning and building that muscle and that awareness, you will be that much more successful. So that cultural piece is very important. So that wraps up conflict and negotiation. And as a recap, we began by defining conflict. So looking at its forms from, goal and cognitive conflict to affective and behavioral conflict, and then recognizing that conflict can occur at multiple levels, right? So from within ourselves, intrapersonal, to across entire organizations, inter-organizational. And then we explore different causes of conflict, things like task interdependence, maybe unclear roles, status inconsistencies, resource competition. We saw how these factors really, if you leave them unaddressed, it can escalate small disagreements into like true organizational rifts. And then from there, we moved into resolving conflict in organizations. So examining strategies that work or that don't work, avoidance or secrecy, and those that do, setting goals, improving communication, bringing in third-party mediators when needed, and then finally focusing on negotiation behavior. So understanding the stages of negotiation, the difference between distributive and integrative approaches, and then how preparation and cultural awareness can really dramatically improve outcomes. Now, throughout this video, I think one thing is clear, and that again is conflict is inevitable, right? But destructive conflict is not. So when you approach disagreements with clarity, with empathy, and with commitment to mutual respect, you really can turn tension into trust and problems into progress. And negotiation, isn't just about compromise, right? It's about discovering solutions that allow everyone to walk away better off than when they arrived. So before I close, just take a moment to reflect on these two questions. The first one being, think of a recent conflict that you've experienced. How might it have turned out differently if the parties had applied maybe an integrative negotiation approach instead of maybe a distributive one? The second thing is, which conflict resolution strategy from this video do you think would be most effective in your own work or life, and why? Now, your answers to these will really help you move these concepts from the page into practical real world action. Thank you for joining.